Hey, I'm Jeff Martin with Magic City Books. We are so thrilled to have you back here for our weekly virtual author series. We've been doing these for, I think, 16 years straight now, it seems like, and every week. But time is a weird thing right in this moment. But we're always thrilled to have you guys back here on Mondays and Thursday nights at 7 p.m. Central Time. For those of you who are watching in other time zones, of course, that can be confusing. So we always do our things at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. We have a lot of fun things coming up. I don't want to go through the whole list, but we have writers booked all the way out. At this point, I believe through September, we have some really amazing fiction, nonfiction. We have everybody from John Waters to Mike Birbiglia to this Thursday, we have the great trans activist and writer Jennifer Finney Boylan, who's going to be talking with us on Thursday evening. And then all the way into the next month, some really important conversations about race and current events coming up. We're doing an event with a gentleman named Edward Ball, who's written this really powerful new book called The Life of a Klansman, which is him kind of looking into his own family's past, but kind of using that as a larger look at race in America, revealing some pretty powerful things. The fact that over half of white Americans now have had someone in the Klan in their family in the past 2 or 3 generations. There's some pretty powerful, sobering things in that book. So we're going to be talking about that with him and a lot of interesting things. So go to our website, magiccitybooks.com, and you can see the full list. Almost all of the events are free and open to the public, so you can join in the conversation. Couldn't be more thrilled to have 2 wonderful authors with us tonight. I was telling them before we jumped on here, it's always nice to have that third party joining us so we can have a little bit livelier conversation, because I'm sure you guys get sick of seeing my face on all these different talks. But when the opportunity came about to talk with Susanna Moore and Dirk Wittenborn, we could not pass that up. I don't have time to go through their full bios, but if you don't know the work of Dirk and Susanna, both have, I was kind of interested to see, both have done works of fiction and nonfiction, and the way that has split to today's talk is, of course, Susanna has a wonderful, powerful kind of gut punch of a memoir called Miss Aluminum, which came out this spring, and Dirk has a new novel called The Stone Girl, which was just out, I guess, in the last 4 weeks. And so we're going to be talking fiction, we're going to be talking nonfiction. These 2 have known each other. We just did the math for 25 plus years and have had some great rapport. So we couldn't be more excited to welcome them. Hello, Susanna. Hello, Dirk.
Hi, Joe. Hello.
Thank you for doing this. I guess I'd like to begin with you, Dirk, and just kind of talk for a second about the fact that your book is just out, and you've entered it into this strange new world, this COVID world, where we were talking. Bookstores have been closed for the most part for the past several months throughout the country, but some have emerged and have begun to open their doors. And even in New York, places like the Strand and other places have reopened. And so you're kind of catching it at a moment that's a little bit different than Susanna had when her book came out in April, whereas that was kind of everything was closed in that moment. What is it like? What's it like having a book drop in this strange time?
In this exact moment, well, bookstores were just, my book was published came out on June 16th. So there was hope they would open, then they didn't open. So about 3 weeks ago, they began to open. My daughter's in the city in New York, and she sees it on the shelf of bookstores. But that's quite recent, that the publishing houses themselves were closed. And as we led up to pub date, I had to kind of be the mail person and send out the book to different places, just because the people like Norton couldn't physically get hold of it for a while. So it's daunting. It's daunting, but it's what is the alternative? It's like your child. You do what you can.
Yeah. Let's talk for a second about The Stone Girl. The setting is such an important part of the book. I mean, the kind of place and the sense of place in the book, the Adirondacks. Can you kind of talk about how important setting is to this book and kind of creating that tone and vibe that I think is such an important part of what you've done here? And also just for our viewers, maybe kind of tell them what the book generally is about.
Well, the book is about the omnipresence of male violence towards women. And it stemmed out of my own personal experiences with someone I loved. My wife had experiences with as a victim of sexual violence, and she's a psychologist. And as over the years, we talked about that, and then I saw that this was something that never really went away, and it gets passed on to other family members and generations. And I said it in the Adirondacks for a couple of reasons. One, I wanted to write about a part of my life I hadn't written about, and I grew up in quite a rural place, and grew up fly fishing and around guns and that sort of thing. And the other thing was, it always amazed me that the Adirondacks is kind of a forgotten place. It's a 6 million acre forest, 8 hours north of New York. And there's one county there that 5 years ago didn't have a single traffic light. And it's with average income, it's the poorest county in the state of New York, but it's also home to people who have 100,000 acres, several people, vast wealth. And given this particular moment in our culture, I thought that's interesting to put those two kinds of people, the haves and the have-nots, up against each other in a very primitive, staggeringly beautiful, but horribly poor place.
You know, it's interesting that when I was reading the book, I was struck by the similarities of how it almost reads like a Southern setting in the sense of kind of the ruralness of the space. And you start to realize that it's actually, there's so much more similarities in the behavior patterns in rural versus urban. It doesn't even really matter if it's rural New York versus rural Alabama or somewhere else. That kind of gun hunting culture, the way that kind of, even just the sexual dynamics, there does seem to be a kind of a split between the rural and the urban, even in today's, country. Do you kind of see some universality to?
Well, yeah, I mean, as a writer, you think about what do I know about that a lot of people don't know about? And as most people either don't come from, have exposure to, rural people who shoot for food regularly. And, it's like that, and roadkill and food stamps. And or grew up around guns. Very few people in the city grew up in families where there were firearms present. And so I wanted to write about that, and I thought people should know about that, because that kind of rural poverty is very particular in some ways, but like poverty anywhere, it's just brutal and unrelenting.
Susanna, to Dirk's point about sexual violence and some of those very difficult conversations, Miss Aluminum is a book that I had only read your fiction, of course, before this. And, you are known for, I would say, pulling no punches in your fiction and being very raw. And I was interested to see how that style, if that's what we call it, how that would lead into a memoir. And it did. You were able to, look at yourself with the same harsh light that you usually project onto your characters. Was that something that is just that inherent to your writing style, or is that something that you have to kind of foster?
I think, and Dirk probably would agree, back me up on this, I think it's inherent to my personality. Don't you think so, Dirk? It's my temperament.
Well, the two things about you, that one, you don't suffer fools, as I've said to you more than once. And second, you have a very good way of segueing, jumping 3 paragraphs ahead in a conversation to something seemingly unrelated, which is what I technically in your book, how you would lead from one kind of trauma to another was just kind of a beautiful work of architecture, I thought. And it full of, it creates a sense of surprise and suspense. I admire that immensely.
Well, the frankness that you mentioned, Jeff, and the rawness, and usually people refer to it about sex, when I write about sex, like in The Cut in particular. Yeah. It's much stronger in the fiction that I've written than in the memoir. the memoir is quite tame, I felt, in part because I left things out, in part because I tried not to be too judgmental, too angry, too embittered, settling grudges. I thought all of that was a very bad idea, a very bad way to write. And as I wrote, I kept a list in my head of people, always men, because I think I have not behaved badly to women, but of men to whom I wanted to apologize. You know, I would be writing, say, about Doug Netter, who is the man that I am able, who saves me from being practically beaten to death by my first husband. And so the list grew as I continued with the book. And then I realized that most of the men to whom I wanted to apologize were dead. So I thought, oh, all right, now you're going to add that regret to your long list of other regrets. I'm quite prone to remorse. So the book is tame, and I did leave things out. I did not about myself, but I tried to be very, very fair, even loving about other people.
You know, there's plenty of moments in this book, and just to lay it out, you know, you're not even 20 yet, you are a model, and you basically enter into a world that is, I don't know, unbelievably destructive and very, I don't know how you would describe it, maybe, you know, full of temptation, but also confusing,
and glamorous.
Yeah, glamorous. Temptation and glamour are very much tied together. But to my point is there's a lot of opportunities here where you could have blamed people. And it seems like you never quite get to that place. And a lot of times it seems like you are putting the onus a lot on yourself for a lot of the darker periods and moments that happen. Do you think that that would have been the case if this book had been written 20 years ago as opposed to now? Is that something that has taken time for you to get to that place?
No, you know what's I think that's happened is the reverse has happened, which is I blame myself less. Mm-hmm. I mean, even though I am full of, you know, even though I want to apologize to a list of people, for example, when I'm raped by Oleg Cassini in the hotel room, you know, if I had written it then, or closer to the time it happened, I absolutely thought that that was my fault. I mean, I knew that what he had done was bad, terrible, wrong, against the law even, but I thought it was my fault. And so the opposite happened. As I grew older and more experienced, I was able to understand that it was not my fault. And so, given your question, the opposite happened. I was a little, I guess you could say, kinder to myself than I would have been when I was younger.
So, you know, you mentioned a very, you know, important and talked about part of the book where, you know, the famous fashion designer Oleg Cassini rapes you. To, you know, not mince our words there. And this Oleg Cassini, who may not have as big of a profile now in memory as people know, but if you know, people don't know, he was one of the biggest names in fashion in the world. We're talking Jackie Kennedy's, you know, dressing the, you know, first lady and all these people. And there are a lot of famous people who kind of come in and out of your orbit. You know, you're reading scripts for famous actors and doing all these different things. But that piece specifically, when you're writing about a trauma like that, I don't even quite know how to ask this question, so forgive me if I don't say it as eloquently as I want to, but you're a fiction writer by trade, and you're writing, when you write your novels, you're looking to write it in a way that is engaging. When you're writing about something so awful and horrible as that, are you even thinking about the style through which you're trying to relay that story? Or is it so raw that you just put it out there? And are you able to edit yourself in a way where you're actually thinking about how it's read?
Yes, because it's a discipline that, you know, this is my 10th book. So I wanted very much for it to be, I didn't want it to be a book about how I became a writer. I thought that was not that interesting. And also a little bit obvious. You know, everything that has happened to me or to Dirk has gone to make each of us and every other writer a writer. So to say it, to ask that question, don't you agree, Dirk? It's almost.
It's funny. Our lives have a similar, our real lives, not the lives of our fictional characters, but both of us were swept up into a very kind of glamorous, fast world full of temptations. And I stumbled into Saturday Night Live and Lorne Michaels and all that world early in my career. And, you know, I don't know whether it was too much too soon or not enough too late, but it's, one is unprepared for it. And as you get older, you realize they thought I knew what I was doing, but I had no idea what I was doing.
They knew what they were doing.
Yeah, or you really, and for me, maintaining my blasé attitude or being frivolous, silly in dealing with these people, they thought that was contrived to a degree. So it's very interesting to see what people project on you and the assumptions they make. And it's also interesting you talk about how to write about what happened to you, Susanna. Or in researching this, I've kept diaries for a very long time, and I was stunned. I mean, since I'm 21, which is really when I first came to New York, and I was stunned rereading them as I was getting into the idea of writing this book, which is really about women. I was struck by how many instances or times I recorded people, men, really being horribly misogynistic. I mean, it was like, it wasn't until I sat down with a big stack of notebooks I realized, God, this is really the theme. These guys are always blaming the woman, blaming that, and making these assumptions. And in terms of what my book is about, I realized, God, they're far more male fortune hunters than there are female in New York City, and they're far more effective.
And nobody writes about them really, or thinks about them, or blames them.
Yeah. No, so the women have it coming. There's one character, it's a part of my book where someone advises, you know, no one ever feels sorry for a rich woman. And that's true, though. One of the four main characters is wealthy, but not the primary one. So it's interesting.
Wealth has been pretty big, Dirk, to kind of talk about some of your past. You brought that up. You know, wealth and the examination of wealth has been a big topic for you over the years. You know, Fierce People, but also, you know, the documentary you were a part of, Born Rich. I mean, yeah. There's obviously something there that you are still mining a little bit. Where does that come from? I mean, obviously, it's been a topic that the haves versus the have-nots is a topic that goes back time immemorial. But, you know, why is that kind of one of the, you know, the things you kind of return to again and again?
Well, I stumbled into that world. My parents were both academics, and they suddenly stumbled, as a consultant, my father stumbled into that world. And then my sister married into it. And I was always the poor boy at the party. And people always assumed, because I was sent to certain kinds of schools and stuff, oh, he must be one of them. And I sadly wasn't. And so what interested me was I just saw New York for a brief moment when I arrived. Being rich wasn't cool. And suddenly it became cool. And that fascinated me. And of course, in the 90s, seeing what happened with that greed culture. But it's, you know, it's really pernicious. I mean, I think that's the pernicious thing about the American aristocracy, the ruling classes. They've convinced the world that America doesn't have one. But of course it does. And I mean, that's coming out more now, but 20 years ago when I wrote Fierce People, people weren't writing or really talking about class.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned, you know, your early days working at Saturday Night Live. You were there, what, late 70s, early 80s, right around that
yeah,
time?
Off and on, yeah.
Which obviously is a very, you know, iconic time period for that show. You know, you've had this really fascinating career where you've kind of been able to back and forth between, fiction, writing novels and writing television or writing films, and kind of going back and forth in that space. Is that something that's by design, or was fiction, which you kind of came to later, of course, that, you weren't writing novels was that something you were always kind of moving
Well, it
towards?
started out as a novelist. I wrote a novel in my early 20s. And, I was just trying to make a living, and also writing novels, writing books, as Susanna, I'm sure will tell you, is very lonely. And the movie world kind of it's like going to the racetrack with your friends. Of course, it almost always ends in heartbreak and betrayal, but there's a sense of camaraderie, which is fun. And, certainly this is not the age where writers used to be able to write novels and write for magazines. That's become increasingly harder in the last 20 years. So film becomes an alternative, and I like it. I mean, God, I've since a child been a huge film buff.
No. Susanna, I was curious, you've written so much about, and people may not know, you grew up in Hawaii, and you've written about that, and there's quite a lot in the book about that. And you write about it in such a way that, I don't know, I'm trying to think about this, in a way that makes it seem like a totally different, obviously a different country, because, it was at one point, but, it just feels like you still see it as a space that seems in some ways very separate from modern American culture. Do you get back there often now?
Yes, I do. I do get back. I was growing up in the 50s and 60s and in Hawaii, and my family still lives there. And it was really, I think this has happened to Dirk too, but I seem to have arrived at places at the end of a certain period. I think, don't you feel that about yourself, Dirk, too, that one was there at the end of something, which gave one quite a different experience and vantage point. But I was there at the end of colonialism, really. It was a very exclusive, very small, the population of Honolulu was 100,000, 90,000 now, it's 1 million people. And it was racist, it was privileged, it was dominated by a very small aristocracy of white people called Hawai'is. And all of that has changed, of course, and it changed with the importation of a kind of mass emigration of slaves. Indentured servants were brought in to work in the cane fields and pineapple fields, Chinese and Japanese, and later Filipino. And when people come to visit me, the first thing they say is, "Oh, it's not very American. It's something else. It's not like being in Malaysia, say, or Singapore or Bali, but there's something off of, something not quite, I think, to put it bluntly, it's not quite white, which is, of course, it's virtue."
Right. Yeah. I was thinking about this, one of the things in the book, of course, is a certain look at the treatment of women of the generation you're part of, which is, the baby boomer generation, the generation that kind of saw the ERA almost happen. And I wonder, you talk about some of these things. Well, let me say it this way. I don't know anybody my mother's age or a baby boomer, a woman who's in the baby boomer generation that did not in some way face some sexual assault or aggression in her life. Like almost no one. If you ask anyone, there will be something. They may not even know it without digging down a little bit, but it was such a regular occurrence in your formative years at that time for everybody that it's pretty shocking to people, I would say my age or younger, that have not experienced that, at least not so obviously, or seen it. Do you think that the omnipresence of that type of behavior and experience makes the current struggles with those things harder because it's not as much of a, at least perceived, a common problem for kind of younger generations of women?
What do you mean, Jeff, that it's harder for young people now to
Yeah,
face
yeah, right. Meaning, like, when you see some of the feminist movements of like 1970s, for example, there, it seemed like there was this huge swath of experience, and a lot of people who were in their, at that time in their 20s maybe, or in their, even in their 30s, who had gone through this period of entering the workforce, dealing with a lot of this subjugation and responding to it, right? A lot of those issues still remain, but they're not as visible as they were, maybe because they, there are things against them. I'm just wondering if you feel like the movement generally is harder now because it's not as, I don't know, I may be saying this wrong, but I'm just trying to think about how generational politics play into fixing some of the problems that you deal with in the book.
Well, I think, Dirk, your daughter is younger than my daughter. My daughter is 40, and she has, in her life, experienced terrible, terrible things, sexual violence from men. And I teach, I teach a seminar for freshmen every year, and I notice that they're much more aware of any sort of infringement. They're very, I remember leaning over and I was helping someone with the paper and sort of brushing against their shoulder. And both of us, he jumped and I jumped, and then we laughed. And I said, I didn't, are you okay? I didn't mean that. And he said, yes, yes, of course. And then at another time, I was asking them to read something of Faulkner, and I said that there were words in it and acts that they might find offensive, and that I was obliged to give them what's called a trigger warning. And they said, oh, please, we don't want trigger warnings. And that surprised me. But then something else, a negative thing happened, which was that there was an article recently, I think in the Washington Post, that did a survey of college students now, all sorts of colleges, big, small, Ivy League. And the result was that they've discovered that 60% of respondents now, 2020, would not report a sexual harassment or a rape or an assault.
What's also disturbing is, and I know this from, my daughter is younger, and talking to her, is just started university, is a great many men know what they're supposed to say. And they're very aware of who's listening. So they'll give lip service to what they should say, but what they do, how they behave alone or amongst other men is quite different. So I don't think it's changed so much. I think people have just gotten clever about hiding it.
Yeah, that actually articulates what I was trying to think was, we see a show like Mad Men, for example, and I think it's easy for us to say that was that generation. We've dealt with those problems. Thank goodness people don't behave that way in the workplace or in society now. It's kind of trapped in some, you mentioned trapped in amber. That's a really interesting way of putting it. We do have a question from one of our panelists that kind of directly to both of you, actually. Kirsten says, the self-blaming that Susanna talks about is such a typical female reaction. In Dirk's novel, this is different because the female takes action and directs that anger outward. Can you guys speak to that? Maybe Susanna first.
Well, I assumed that, I was thinking about this today, that Dirk, the book takes place in the present.
Yes.
Doesn't it? Yes. So it would reflect how times have changed. But it would also reflect that very, very much that again, the childhood of the girl, that she knows how to, I'm talking about LA, that she knows how to handle a gun, set a trap. She knows, she has a sense of herself that comes from having had that childhood. I remember growing up in Hawaii gave me very much a kind of physical confidence, because I grew up outside with boys, and there was really nothing a boy could do that I couldn't do, except maybe urinate standing up. And of course, I tried that and didn't work. But it was a long time. It wasn't until I was maybe 12 or 13 that I realized being a girl was not a great thing. It was going to work against me. And I think your character, one of the things I love about her is I don't think she ever succumbed to that. I don't think she ever felt diminished by the realization that she was a girl, except because of what men did to her.
Yeah. Well, early in her life, she's disfigured. So that kind of counts her out of the game, that she becomes a lesser creature to men, and that saves her. But
and it's a metaphor for being female.
yes,
Yeah, disfigured.
she's born with a very large birthmark on one side of her face that she has removed at a certain point in her life. But, you know, so many heroines, I have a problem with them because the heroines who do take action, because when they pick up the gun or learn martial arts, I never find it believable, like someone would suddenly learn these things. And Evie, for all the protagonist, for all the deprivations and shortcomings of her childhood and the way her parents raised her, they did raise her to protect herself. And that's, and that I wanted to explore, and I wanted to write a book, a novel for my daughter, just so, you know, of a woman believably taking charge and believably, and having very clever, thought through reasons, long-term reasons for the revenge, the different kinds of revenge she takes. And obviously The Count of Monte Cristo was one of my favorite books as a child. So this was fun to channel that.
And also one of the other things I loved about the book was that she, and this of course has a lovely irony, is that she uses male methods. In other words, traditionally women seek revenge through, you know, poison or stabbing someone, or, you know, that they don't, they're very limited in the resources they have to enact revenge. And she doesn't.
Not to spoil anything, there's we're not giving too much away there. I do want to take a moment and say a commercial here, which is, if you don't have a copy of Miss Aluminum or The Stone Girl, you guys got to get one right now. We're going to put some links here in the chat so you can buy a copy of each directly from us. We're doing a special today, 2 for the price of 2, Stone Girl and Miss Aluminum. So it's just one night only. So back to our regular programming. Susanna, I'm curious, you deal with a lot of known and famous individuals in this memoir. Was there any legal ramifications to use these people's names or speak about incidents? Did you have to kind of worry about any blowback? Because a lot of these people are still living.
Well, I was a little nervous, you know, as you know, the publishing house has lawyers who go over everything, and especially a book like this, they would go over it. And I expected them to ask me to take out certain things, but they did not, and they were more focused on things that surprised me. For example, they wanted me to take out that what Jack Nicholson says about Hitler. And I said that I didn't think that was necessary. I didn't think Jack would care what I wrote about what he said about Hitler, and if he would even read it. And they also, in the first draft, or in many drafts, it was in, it was out, it was in, it was out. It was the last name of my first husband, the one who beats me, and they suggested that, and this is very interesting because it's quite female. They suggested I take it out because it might harm him. And I remember thinking, oh, speaking of irony, that's ironic that it would, you know, hurt his feelings or get him in trouble, or maybe his family didn't know about it, and wasn't I concerned about his feelings? And I thought,
well, I just want to interject. I've known Susanna for a long time, and she'd never told me that story. But then, and so when I got the book and I flipped the page and got to that, I was like, oh, but it explains so many conversations we've had.
does it?
Yeah, it does. Because you spoke in one or two instances with an edge in your voice, and I went, oh, that's where that came from. Now, and it's interesting, at that point, if someone who's as gabby as me probably would have revealed what had happened. But I could see it several conversations we've had over the years, and it was just very powerful, not seeing it coming, and that you really, and which is again female, to keep it to yourself, that you didn't.
Although I have to say, and to Kirsten who asked the question, in that instance, he was not on my list of people to whom I wish to apologize, and I did not find that it was my fault that I was beaten so badly.
I hope so.
So I didn't think I was to blame, which is, thank goodness.
Susanna, I'm curious, obviously, we all know that, this is not an autobiography. This is looking at a certain period of your life, and it's not a full 360-degree look at you as an individual throughout everything you've done. But do you think this will be the last memoir that you write, or will we see more chapters and interesting parts? You've lived a very interesting life and left things out of this book, certainly.
I know I've been asked, and my publisher asked me, and other people have asked me, I don't think I want to write anymore. And I really don't want to write anymore I'm so sick of my childhood. Dirk, don't you have that feeling sometimes? You just think, oh, I just cannot write about my parents or think about it.
That's why I went to the Adirondacks.
I've grown up.
Yeah, but I'm sick of it at times, but I think that it's to take another angle at it. And I guess because I have an older sister I'm very close with and see a lot of. So we're constantly dredging up the past. It's inescapable, and
especially if they're mysteries.
Yeah, disguise it in fiction, especially if they're mysteries and lies in your childhood. But it's much braver. It's much harder when you're writing a memoir or those things I've had to write about myself that have been biographical, truly biographical, and name names. That's awkward, and that it exhausts you in a certain way because you're going. They deserve it, the truth, but do I really want to get in that trouble? Does that show I'm vengeful? Haven't I not matured, gotten beyond that? It's a different series of questions.
Name dropping, which I have been doing, which makes me wince.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think of it as that, but
I
have been criticized.
But how else do you tell the story? How else do you given the time?
So, Dirk, I'm curious, this is not really on topic, but I'm just curious to see what you think about this. You did this documentary you were part of called Born Rich, which I saw when it came out. And it's probably been, 15 plus years ago when it came out, but I saw it when it came out. And it was a pretty big deal when it came out, but it's taken on a new life because one of the focuses of the documentary. Now, this is a documentary about the effects of multi-generational wealth and on kids and how it impacts their lives. And one of the people you focus on in the book is Ivanka, and the documentary is Ivanka Trump.
Yeah, it was interesting. I did it at the same time I wrote my novel Fierce People, and I made it with my nephew who was just getting ready to turn 21. And I had the idea struck me. He was interested in movies in general. I said, well, if you want to make a movie, we should make a movie about this group of your friends, you and your friends. And it took a while to talk everybody into it, but it was a chilling experience. I mean, the short hairs on my neck rose as you were talking to them and the things they said. And I was, it was everything I feared about the class system in America, the hidden class system, was really kind of revealed. And it was interesting how America took it, and the documentary had success. HBO bought it, and it was at Sundance before that. But it was, I think, a lot of people at the time it came out there was something pornographic about it. It was like watching porno for them. It was like, ooh, I wish I was born rich, or wouldn't this be great? And there was, the conversations really shifted about wealth from 2002, 3, whenever that came out, to now. But it's always, I've always seen this as a real issue in America.
It's a really fascinating film. If you guys haven't seen it, find it. I'm sure it's streaming somewhere, and it's like a Rorschach test. It's like, the way people saw Wall Street when it came out. Some people wanted to be Gordon Gekko, and some people wanted to never, ever see a person like Gordon Gekko in their whole life. And it just said a lot about you, how you reacted to that movie. But thanks for just touching base on that. I was really interested in to see that. I'm curious, when the pandemic started and we started locking things down, for about a month, every writer or book site about writing or book website was doing articles about Shakespeare writing stuff during the plague and all these horrible things about, you're going to get more stuff done now than you've ever done before. You're going to be the most productive writer you've ever seen. I'm curious for both of you if this period has been more productive than usual, or if you've felt some paralysis.
Quite the opposite. I'm sorry to say, I don't know about Dirk. I don't have an idea in my head. I feel as if I'm floating. I have no complaints because there is such suffering around us, but I can't really concentrate. It's very difficult even to finish a book, reading a book, let alone start writing a book. And I also have a theory. I've discussed this with Dirk, which is that one of the advantages of getting older, supposedly, is that you are relieved of some of your anger and fury and even grief. And I have realized that a lot of my earlier books were completely fueled by anger and grief, especially books like In the Cut, or I was teaching in women's prisons. I've taught in prisons a lot. There's a book I wrote about women in prison. And, without that anger and fury, which has dissipated with time, it's harder to write something. I don't know, do you feel that, Dirk? It's an awful admission. You're younger than I am, so.
Well, but no, not so much. But what I feel is I'm trying to get over that anger. And there's one kind of writing I did that I got it written fast because I was really angry about something, but the anger tilted it. That if people who knew me read it, they distorted it. It distorted it and kept it from being something bigger, or possibly. And I think one thing I am pleased about The Stone Girl is there wasn't the sense of anger. I wrote it with a sense of concern and sadness, and
the grief is there.
Kind of an oh my God feeling, as opposed to Jesus Christ, you know what I mean? And but as to working now, I had a project start just before COVID, and I kind of threw myself into it, but so sitting at the desk was an escape from what was happening in the world around me. I was again in a kind of a remote place. But I think the thing is, COVID is beneficial in that it's making me think more. What does it mean to be at this stage of my life and just sit in my own skin? And I'm someone who's always self-medicated with people. So self-isolation, felt like, cold turkey to me. It was very hard.
Not felt like it, it was.
It was, but yeah, I think the hopeful side of me just goes, well, maybe this will make people more contemplative and more, because we'd be more thoughtful and introspective.
Yeah, I think that's the case. I vacillate every day between, despair and invigoration at the challenge. And I think that's somewhat normal. I want to say thank you to you both for joining us tonight, and also to all of our guests for watching. If you guys don't have a copy of these two wonderful books, The Stone Girl and Miss Aluminum, please do so. There's links right here. You can do that and get them directly from us. And when you do that, you're supporting the work we do at Magic City Books, also our nonprofit mission, to connect people with great reads. And that's exactly what these two books are. So I want to say thank you to Susanna and to Dirk for joining us. A really lovely conversation. I couldn't have asked for a better trio of conversation tonight. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was fun.
Yeah.
Lovely to see you.
I hope to see you very soon. Yeah.
Yes.
And thank to you all for watching. Stay safe, take care, and read more. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Thank you.